to the Con Pod. I am your host, Lolo, and I'm going to take you on a little bit of a different podcast journey than you might have expected. And boy, do I have a story for you. We got trucks, we got drugs, we got catfishing, betrayal, and parasocial nightmares, as well as a lot of laughs and even more art. I've been watching right-wing media to understand how it shapes our body politic and how it has allowed so much more vocal bigotry to be given a center stage. I've studied languages and I've dreamed of voice acting as well as singing because it's always fascinated me. And how people connect or not to one another is also interesting. Add in my passion for social justice and long history of working alongside those seeking to improve our world, I do care about how politics advances or doesn't our more perfect union. For me, an important concept that's wrapped up in that is the term media literacy. And that, for me, means that if we have an informed populace, the results will be better for all of us, and that the integrity of information and voices matters. Our story begins before the chortle of any Pistons even fired a shot. Way up in Canada, on a cold, snowy Ottawa morning.
Beating for my family?
You've been affected.
You have to take a beating for your family, Rose.
All right, I'm ready. I'm ready.
Come on, guys.
Are you ready to beat the innocent people?
10,000 people by one police estimate are now in the nation's capital.
They are protesting not just vaccine mandates, but to demand an end to pandemic-related restrictions, calling for government officials like the Prime Minister to resign.
The police this whole time saying that they've treated the truckers with respect and they're just doing their job well. Think about that when they're beating your ass.
The Canadian Freedom Convoy started in January 22nd of 2022 to fight COVID restrictions and was intended to shut down the capital Ottawa and border points to force the government to abandon their emergency measures and vaccine mandates. When I had more time in my day, for reasons not important to this podcast, and especially since January 6th, I've watched extremist and anti-democracy movements closely. And I did hear about Ottawa. As a troll mostly on Twitter, I hadn't spent a lot of time on YouTube. It just wasn't in my world that way. But when the Canadian trucker convoy appeared on the political landscape, my ears pricked up. I'd been following and hoping to torture, in the metaphorical sense only, Mike Lindell and his band of merry fuckwads who helped destroy confidence in election systems since 2021. As a wannabe comedian, I looked for opportunities to join this new, for me, platform that gave the opportunity through chat to push back. It was more of a therapy for me than actual impact. My troll of choice was to drop questions in the Ottawa chats such as, "Trump's dead?" and see if it raised any hackles. It didn't. I was basically a decided flop. Ottawa ended up being a bad rave with frozen trucks, loud horns, harassment of locals, and a complete disregard for organization. On February 23rd, it officially closed and went out with the whimper of a waning horn battery. It was part of the legacy of the Freedom, D-U-M-B, movement in Canada, however, and it's why we had the convoy in the United States, which is really where our story is. I want to introduce you to the U.S. equivalent of the Ottawa movement, the Peoples Convoy.
In numbers, the Peoples Convoy, similar to the Freedom Convoy of Canadian truckers, is full steam ahead as they look to protest COVID-19 mandates.
We're going to see how far this trucker thing goes. Are they going to shut down major cities like Chicago, Los Angeles? You know, we've got Washington, D.C. coming up first. Will they shut down other shithole Democrat strongholds like Portland and Seattle?
All right, next up is Mayor Reyes himself. He is the mayor of this beautiful city, the city of Adelanto, and endless possibility to say a few words. Mayor Reyes.
Thank you to the People's Convoy for allowing Adelanto to be the city where this gay protest gets started. And we love you guys, and stay blessed.
We started in California in the middle of the desert, looking through first responder media's Joe Felix's windshield into a pale sunrise in Adelanto, in what seemed to be a Mad Max flatland that had only this gathering clustered together in what would become a triggering sight, a trailer bed of truck from which the carnival barker du jour would orate, almost signaling that what you're about to hear may amaze you and will undoubtedly push you further into the LARP. By the way, this would end up much more sad sacks than Mad Max, so spoiler alert. Joe Felix, who would adopt or initiate, I can't really recall, the nickname Taco Joe, which I won't use and have never used, seemed dispassionate, which was welcome since I was new to watching YouTube streamers and had experienced Canadian streamers and their quick to ban any dissenting voices. I would soon learn that he was actually going to seem quite at home. I don't know why, and it's not my business, but it made me sad that he gave up his dispassion so easily, almost transactionally, for being part of this group of angry, mostly white, and mostly what I would call libertarian secessionist leaning, if I had to label, which I don't. And we met Lee Dundas, known to me because of her involvement in anti-public health movements in Southern California, and as a lawyer representing, I'm sure, a lot of sketchy folks. She's been part of many anti-government movements and many disinformation campaigns, and she's a classic huckster, if that term still exists, who would probably sell her grandmother if it would advance her standing in the professional rabble-rousing community. Lee's a carnival barker in fake pearls, an agnostic opportunist. She's a walking SNL skit, complete with Junior League sweater and scarf combos and that wedge cut that just completes the look. Makes her out of place at an uprising, but more at home screaming at you in the parking lot of Ralph's. Lee had connected with Chris Marston, another lawyer based in Boston, and said they were inspired by Canada to support a U.S. equivalent. So the People's Convoy was born. I won't be getting into the journalism of who ran, didn't, or tried to run the People's Convoy, or TPC as it would come to be known, but I want to encourage you to look further into the many manias of Lee Dundas and her motley crew of leaders. And we'll meet a few of our lesser magistrates, as some of them would start to call themselves, driving forward to insist that any emergency measures dealing with COVID were quickly removed because, freedom. On the way, the measures were actually eased, which was quite a disappointment to the drivers, but it didn't stop our intrepid heroes from trying to tilt at those windmills.
We're definitely moving away from the mandates, but most of us American citizens are afraid, and especially us type, are afraid they're going to bring them back for almost any reason.
This was an interesting evolution of the messaging. The freedom to deny science and resist participation in public health measures always stayed a part of it, but it definitely started to advance the more insurrection-y themes, such as the socialist takeover and evil cabals of Democrats who also wanted to take their guns and kill babies after they're born. When the Americans left Adelanto, I found other streams that made it easier to monitor more feeds at once. At the time, I was an individual, but I started to get outreach from unfamiliar and familiar contacts, inviting me into convoy watching groups on Twitter through direct messaging. It was fun. I finally had people I could watch this with. It became an obsession, rising early to track them as they made their way east, celebrating all the overpass groups who cheered them on, of which there weren't actually that many. Bringing their flags, their flag clothings, their flag cars, their flag trucks, their flag children. Everything was draped in the flag. They became emotional at the sight of the convoy, those folks on the overpass, which rose to a size of about, 100, 200 maybe vehicles, not all trucks. So much less a trucking convoy than a disgruntled fake-riot convoy. The people on the off-ramp believed that these souls in these vehicles would represent them to the demonic swamp creatures in D.C. Oh, how wrong they were. They ended up in Hagerstown, Maryland, after a puffed-up chest entry into the Beltway, with some chickening out at the last minute to really cause a ruckus. They parked their cars in the middle of downtown D.C. and stayed for moments, encountered angry local residents who were all too used to seeing idiots in their city claiming some kind of redress of grievances. This was not a new sight to them. The convites, as we would begin to call them, wanted desperately to make citizens' arrests and take back the country from the woke virus cabal globalists who worked at the local bagel shop or the CIA. It didn't matter. They celebrated in Hagerstown, building their own community on a racetrack property, complete with zones that relegated the less desirables, which is kind of a fine point, to the back 40. Inexplicably, the less desirables were really just as undesirable as the others, but they figured out their caste system pretty quickly. Characters started to emerge immediately, and it became 12 to 18-hour-long viewing opportunities each day of their time at the camp and the few loops they made around D.C. They indeed had a meeting with Ted Cruz, but it was merely a photo opportunity.
And so I am proud to stand with you. I am proud to stand alongside you as we fight for freedom. And people are waking up all across this country. People are waking up. And there's a very simple message. You know, several of us met earlier this week in the Capitol. What the men and women want here is for the government to leave you the hell alone.
It would be a beautiful reminder of just how ineffective they were. When we were viewing hours and hours per day, that pretty much said as much about them as it did about me. I woke up for it, searched for the most salacious purveyors of content, and hopped from tab to tab on devices and screenshotted and recorded bits and bobs that I thought would be important. I don't know why now. I managed them on devices, monitoring the Twitter DM room and forming connections with people in those DM rooms. They took hold quick. There was some back and forth in the two DM rooms I was involved in. One seemed more serious than the other, some independent journalists and others I didn't really recognize. Turns out that not everyone is who they appear to be. Somehow I found myself in another group, less formal, and dedicated to pranking and monitoring the convoy together. We created successful and complicated intrigue, pranking the convites right and left, disrupting their plans and becoming characters in the story ourselves. At one point, I was known as Laughing Lola, a name given to me by Roger on the mall when they were in their later iteration of the convoy, and not so much convoying, but rather sitting. One of the first pranks was promising a delivery of 100 sub sandwiches for them by a local fan who fully supported the cause. In the prank, the driver had had a terrible accident, and there were subs everywhere on the highway. Sorry, maybe next time. Thankfully, no injuries. The group would continue to prank and create fake bluegrass bands, promises of tour vans for D.C., a potential land deal at one point, and more. It drove the convites mad, and it was brilliant. The talent for the details and execution was left to the others. I boosted where needed, but really was more of a cheerleader, although I would love to take credit for those pranks. They were good. Over time, we had our own drama within the group. One member who sent pictures to the group of his idyllic ranch life and flirted with all the ladies. I had certainly fallen for it. After the group had used their skills finding out more about him, it turned out he'd had what I'd call significant legal entanglements in his early youth and was about to return to the system for a short stint. Not an unkind catfish, but a bottom feeder, just the same. We watched practically 12 to 18 hours a day beginning in late February 2022, busily back-chatting in Twitter DM rooms and chatting in the actual streams, if allowed. Many of us, myself included, were immediately banned in the early days of stream watching and chatting from the Fuck Your Feelings crowd of freedom, and that's with a UMB at the end instead of an OM. They recoiled at any questioning of their motive, their aims, their tactics, or their understanding of how the government works, in hindsight a blessing in disguise. as becoming more of a center player in this telenovela would end up being a definite curse for many. But did I learn my lesson? Oh, fuck no. I kept watching and learning and becoming more entrenched in intrigue. But I won't be able to give you the empirically researched documentary of the ragtag mix of truckers, of which there were not many, self-declared rebels, which is a stretch and a very gracious term, and the infiltrators who called themselves the convoy. It's also my own experience as a watcher, in the trenches with others who I thought shared similar enough worldviews and an earnest interest in documenting any potential larger impact this event could have, and who were excellent, oftentimes hilariously driven trolls. But beyond the trucks and the horns, a few actors emerged from a completely different perspective to achieve their own unrelated, unsavory ends. And that's the untold part of the story, but hopefully no more. I present the Con Pod.
What a mess, what a mess, what a mess. Wow, what a mess.